Hi everybody, good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It is May 2nd, 2016. There's a lot of webinars I could do around addiction, and I'm going to combine really a couple of the main themes that I've talked about before with addiction. I'm going to talk about defining addiction, and I'm also going to talk about a little bit about how we treat it, and those two, of course, relate to each other in a lot of ways. And so I may do another one on addiction later, but this really came out of the webinar on determining whether something is addiction or experimentation, and I think a lot of parents have that question. So we'll talk about some general guidelines, ways to think about it. There's two basic ways to understand and define addiction. The Diagnostic Manual, the DSM, that's one way to do it. And then basically, like every other mental health issue, they organize it around symptoms. And specifically, they'll talk about the level of tolerance or withdrawal from a substance or an activity, and how does that affect the person? Do they have significant withdrawal symptoms? Using larger amounts for longer periods of time, persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down use, time spent obtaining alcohol or drugs and recovering from the effects, social, occupational, and recreational pursuits are given up or reduced because of alcohol use. Use is continued despite knowledge of drug, alcohol-related harm, physical or psychological. So that's a basic way. That's what gives therapists, clinicians a right to diagnose somebody with substance use disorder, right? Or addiction is the lay term. That really is what gives us the right, because we can look at this and we can evaluate it. But there's going to be a theme tonight when I talk about it, that addiction in many ways is really a self-diagnosis, right? It comes from the self-help literature, the AA literature around the only person really who is important in defining themselves as an addict is the person themselves. So I think for parents sometimes we get really caught up in trying to answer that question, and you don't really need to answer it for yourself. The addict or person using substances, they need to answer it for themselves. And what we can do as treatment professionals, and you can do as families, is we can provide them exposure, opportunities to look at it. And see, a lot of people will stop drinking or using drugs at varying levels of dysfunction, varying levels of disruption in their life. Some people, it's not, they're not happy. It's not going well for them, right? Or they're not feeling well. For some people, it takes being put in jail, significant job or academic and problems in their life, right, in their functioning. Sometimes divorce, sometimes a whole lot of things. And so some people's bottom is much, much lower. And so it really doesn't become that important at us deciding for the other person if they are that. We can say, looks like you have a problem, looks like you're struggling, looks like you fit many of these watermarks. And so we're going to ask you to look at yourself, ask you to be honest with yourself in the process. So I'll talk about that as we go along tonight. A few folks. Of teens who have used either nicotine or marijuana by 13, 68 will develop a drug or alcohol dependency later in life. 40% of those started drinking at 13 years of age or younger develop alcohol dependency later in life. Compare this with 10% who began drinking after 17. There's a direct correlation between the time of critical incident and the intervention and success. All this is saying is it matters if it's young, right? If we can address it younger, and we can recognize that, and I'm going to talk about this in a few ways tonight. The adolescent brain, and I'm going to define the adolescent brain like Daniel Siegel does. That's a brain between the age of 12 and 25 or so. The adolescent brain is different than the adult brain. And alcohol and drugs impact it differently and have greater negative effects on them, and also predispose them to addiction in ways that doesn't happen if somebody's introduced to drugs or alcohol later on in life. So I'll talk about 3 stages from the literature, kind of the way that we can think about it. And again, these are general guidelines. Early on, there's self-medicating in general. It can start off with cigarettes. It can start off with pot and drinking. Those are typical gateway drugs. But I will tell you, something new has happened in the past several years, where people are skipping the gateway drugs sometimes. That's happening. People are going to heroin earlier than they used to because it's so accessible and relatively inexpensive. And of course, highly addictive. So these are just general guidelines. Might steal medication from parents, from the medicine cabinet. School problems might begin. Maybe you can see those. A lot of you identify those as your markers, as your reason for having your child come to a voc. Rule violations, not coming home on time. There's not usually a lot of consequences from these. That doesn't just mean parents. It just means they're just not getting into a lot of trouble related to it, right? They're able to hide it. Like it says here, control it. They begin to develop a tolerance for using. Oftentimes it's very social. It's about fitting in. It becomes kind of the entryway into a peer group. And fitting in becomes more important than actual, or at least at this stage it's more important than the use of the medication. Self-medicating is. Attention span starts to decrease. Frustration tolerance starts to lower. And there's problems and drama in the peer group. So this isn't very different from a lot of average teenagers, right? A lot of this stuff could be happening in a lot of teenage life. So as we escalate up these three stages, we'll see them be more significant. At this point, there's been some attempts to stop using, to limit. I'll only drink beer. I'll only do it on weekends. I won't drink at a certain time. I won't smoke if I go to work. There are attempts to do it, and failed attempts at that. There's a strong desire to blame or shift the focus onto other people for what they're doing. They begin experimenting and expanding. Oftentimes, they are violating things that they said they would never do at this point, right? They're experimenting with drugs that they said they would never experiment with or use. Using instead of or during important activities, right? At work, at school, at gatherings where they need to be sober to function. Withdrawing from family and friends and changing peer groups. Sometimes that's the marker for parents. And again, it's hard because sometimes adolescents go through this anyway in a different stages. So that's where you start to look at a lot of these things. And again, a lot of this can be an awareness piece for the child themselves, the individual themselves, if they're doing it. Stealing line become, of course, more common. Academic decline, if they're working, same kind of problem. Mood swings increase the time that they're using. Preoccupation begins to increase at this point, right? They think about it all the time. Much time is spent getting, planning for it, thinking about it, talking about it. Family conflict increases. Legal difficulties might start to come up at this point. You know, this is when they're starting to have consequences for their use. And the tolerance, of course, is getting more significant. A lot of adolescents will describe it's like a new normal for them. And so their level of functioning, oftentimes, it's hard to tell when they're high, when they're in this second stage as they progress, because it is, in some ways, just a new baseline for them. Of course, the consequences begin to increase here. Suspension, being expelled from school, legal problems. It starts to become the cause of many of their problems. And I'll say this, people start drinking for the same reason they stop, and that is to feel better. So at this point, the anxiety, the emotional, the mood state is much more, it's up and down. It's out of control. It's beyond them. It now has them. The signs of withdrawal symptoms when they try not to use or stop. Isolating, using alone to cope to feel normal. Like I said, anger outbursts often when not using. That's another thing that parents can be aware of, is that oftentimes when they're using, they're not upset. They're not angry. It's when they're not using that they become upset, oftentimes. And so that can be confusing to people. They're not only using, stops trying to hide their use. Right now it's so out of control and so obvious that it's just in everybody's face. Binging or daily use, stealing, dealing, or prostituting to support habit, weight gain or weight loss, high tolerance and or withdrawal identifies with the culture. Now it's at the forefront, right? They've given up their sports, their music, school has been sacrificed, all the things that they used to value take a significant second seat to substance use and abuse at this point. Here's the question, right? What's the difference in approaches between somebody who's experimenting or somebody who's addicted in that third phase? And the answer is there's almost no difference in the treatment, right? When I have clients that will tell me, I'm not an addict, I'm a social user, I could quit any time, my response is fantastic. The 12 steps or the therapy we're doing are going to be there to make sure that you have a healthy relationship with alcohol or cigarettes or any other substance, right? It's going to make sure that that's a healthy relationship. And so I get out of the battle of trying to convince them that they're an addict. And I think that's what so many parents can fall into, family members can fall into, right? That becomes a part of the codependent behavior about getting into that power struggle and trying to convince them. When I was sitting and listening to a panel years ago, I've told this story, the panelists who had worked at several young adult addiction treatment centers were asked the question, if you had a parent come to you, what are the things you would tell them if they asked the question, I can't convince my addict son that he's an addict, an alcoholic. What do you do? How do you do that? And my answer was, you don't convince them. You provide them with the tools so that they can look at themselves more honestly, right? And then they get to decide their life, right? At that point, they get to decide, is this a problem? And that can apply to any kind of behavior, not just the targeted addictive behaviors, not just the alcohol and drugs, which of course are very, very dangerous and harmful. But it can be the relationship that they have with a lot of behaviors in their life and with other people, with their emotions. Like I said, it matters earlier, and so we want to provide them tools to be able to look at themselves. I think the 12 steps, for example, I'm going to talk about the 12 steps and the 7 challenges. I'll give you a couple of other references to some approaches also, but I'm going to talk about those two a little bit more because I think those are the ones that are used most often in our industry, although there's a couple that are on the rise. These are really just healthy living. I have a webinar that I've done called The 12 Steps for Somebody Who's Not Addicted. They're really valuable principles for just getting by and being healthy in life, right? And that's why even drawing that line between the codependent and the non-codependent, it's not important. Can I be benefited? This is something that can be helpful for me in my emotional, psychological, spiritual growth. Talk a little bit about the effects on the young brains. Like I said, it affects the brain very differently. It changes the wiring. Right? It interrupts a critical growth period of wiring and pruning from 12 to 25. Once we reach adulthood, the window of opportunity for major remodeling of the brain closes, and we are essentially stuck with the brains we have, for better or for worse. And it's not absolutely true, but the brain is more plastic in childhood, and so changing the hard wiring during that time will have a greater impact and put one at greater risk. Alcohol acts like a computer virus in the brain by slowing it down or shutting it down brain activity, deleting or distorting messages, damaging the connections, right? We're trying to build that prefrontal cortex where it's developing, and the wiring that's going from the bottom up to the top so that we can make rational decisions, wise decisions that can anticipate consequences to help us to be organized. Those are getting interrupted during that time. A real important piece is what it does to the pleasure reward system. See, in adolescence, before adulthood, our pleasure system is much more, it needs a lot more to be triggered, to experience pleasure. When you're an adult sitting reading a book by a fire, taking a nap, right? Taking a stroll on the beach, those can be very pleasurable. For adults, they find a lot of satisfaction in them. Children don't find it. That's why they have these risky, seemingly impulsive behaviors. And if you replace the reward system with alcohol or drugs, you decrease its capacity to be affected, and therefore they develop a kind of depression, right? They become dependent on the alcohol or drugs to give them a sense of well-being. And then because it's being done chemically, the brain stops producing it, and they become dependent on it. And so stopping it puts them at risk for depression or suicidal ideation or anxiety or a lot of other mental health issues around that mood. So it's important to understand that. That's why adolescence is a critical time. That slide didn't turn out very well, did it? So cognitive behavioral therapy, social model, social learning, and positive peer culture's 12-step. I'm going to talk about 12-step and the motivational interviewing one, the 7 challenges. It's important to know that we use all that work here, right? A lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is inherent in addiction treatment, right? You're challenging distorted thinking. You're challenging the delusional thinking, the denial, the lies that the alcoholic or addict brain tells itself. right? That's what's going on here. You're also giving the family those kinds of ideas about challenging unhealthy, distorted beliefs and roles in the family. So there's system work and system treatment that can go into that. But like I said, a lot of what people who go through lifelong recovery attach themselves is to a 12-step model, and so there's some new models coming up. So I'm just going to read through these really quickly, but then I'm going to talk about the principles involved, because I think it's one of the most misunderstood theories, applications out there. Step one, we admitted we are powerless over alcohol, and that our lives have become unmanageable. So this is just about humility, right? This is about an awareness, like this, I can't do this. I can't have a healthy relationship with alcohol. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. This is just about humility. And in Buddhism, they would say radical acceptance, right? This is to say, there's a surrender here that's a letting go. That it's okay, that if I'm in pain, I'm in pain. And that if a difficult thing happens in my life, I trust. I'm turning it over. It doesn't mean one becomes passive and not active. On the contrary, one remains or becomes very active in this process. But there's a recognition that we don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. We don't have it all figured out in this process. And that we don't have to control everything, including our brain chemistry by ingesting chemicals. Then these next few talk about shame and guilt. So step 4 is make a searching and fearless moral inventory. Admitted to our God, to ourselves, and to one other human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So you write it down, and then you read it to somebody. And these are very long. This is everything you can possibly think of. And then you ask, again, there's a faith, there's a letting go, like, I can heal, I can get better. You ask your higher power. You trust that there's something that can help you do this. And you ask them to remove shortcomings. And then you get into the making amends piece, right? Making it better, making it right. So we make a list, we make amends whenever possible. And then the 10th step is something, we do it every day, right? This becomes something that the addict or person in recovery does every day. Like, I'm going to say sorry. I mean, can you imagine just how healthy everybody would be if we could do that 10th step, right? We would be glad if all of our family members did this all the time. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying for knowledge of His will and His power to carry that out. So committed to a spiritual life of some kind. And it's very important, especially with adolescents. You don't have to have anybody's idea of God. Sometimes people talk about God as the group of drunks at Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Sometimes it can be the universe. It could be a power and energy. It can be a specific God. But it can be just about anything, if that person can experience a trust and a letting go in the process. And then service is number 12. Practicing service, giving back. This is what the people who started Alcoholics Anonymous figured out were the 12 principles that, if followed, they could make people that had tried many other things to stop drinking, that it made it effective. So it's from personal experience. I think about it as control and transcendence, overcoming what is. I think there's a transcendent principle of faith or radical acceptance, meaning that what happens to me doesn't define me, but it's how I deal with it. And part of that can be in relationship to a higher power. Taking it a day at a time. There's a mindfulness quality to it, right? Leaning into it, feeling it. They have lots of slogans and lots of sayings, and one of them is if you turn sober into an acronym, it might stand for son of a SOB. Everything is real. Like, they feel everything. It's having a relationship with your emotions. There's a surrender and a humility. I think what gets misunderstood a lot, when one says one is an addict or a recovering addict, what they're saying is, I have a weakness in this area. I have a vulnerability. And so I have to remain vigilant. Right? I think we can all relate to some things in our lives that we have a weakness around. It might be a food, might be an activity where we get triggered, or certain people. And for the alcoholic or the drug addict, it's substance, it's mind-altering substances. And so what they're saying when they say that is, they're not saying they'll grow. Many of them talk about it being very, very grateful and a very spiritual program and being very happy and always growing and always progressing. Most of them working a program will tell you that. But what they say is, I need to be vigilant in this area. I can't take it for granted like you can with alcohol, perhaps, if you're a normie, if you're a normal person, not an addict. So there's a vigilance there. There are rituals and group support and community. That's a big piece of it, right? We know that group support and communities is a huge thing to help people stay sober. It's a big contributor. And like some of the recent research that they're doing with rats that's been published everywhere in the New York Times, the suggestion is that the study shows that if rats are together in a group, they shun the substances that they're offered, whereas if they're alone, they get addicted to them and die from them. So the conclusion, kind of the flagship kind of slogan that they come up with is that sobriety is not the opposite of addiction. Connection is. So there's something about this. It's a break of connection, and this community is a way to rebuild that, to heal that piece of it. There's a lot of getting rid of the shame. The idea is you're only as sick as your secrets. The things that you hide inside. Not the specific secrets make you sick, but that the idea of hiding, not being your authentic self, is part of this disease. And then, of course, there's an empathic response. Right? It's without judgment. It's a brain disease, right? And we wouldn't judge somebody who had cancer or a torn ligament in their knee as bad or unlovable because they had it. We would have a lot of compassion. So it changes it to that kind of thing. This is something else that came. This is, I think, one of the other most misunderstood things I see in the treatment industry. People see the 7 challenges as an alternative, maybe because it's a number to the 12 steps, right? They see it as an alternative or competing model. And in my experience, what I'm about to read to you, everybody could use the 7 challenges and everything that they do, right? You could use the 7 challenges when you're using the 12 steps. And so this is this research-based approach that they talk about that a lot of adolescent programs will use. And here they are. We decided to be open and talk honestly about ourselves and alcohol and other drugs. We looked at what we liked about alcohol and other drugs and why we were using them. We looked at our use of alcohol or other drugs to see if it had caused harm or could cause harm. We looked at our responsibility and the responsibility of others for our problems. We thought about where we seemed to be headed, where we wanted to go, and what we wanted to accomplish. We made thoughtful decisions about our lives and about our use of alcohol and other drugs. We followed through on all our decisions about our lives and drug use. If we saw problems, we went back to earlier challenges and mastered them. So, I mean, how general, that's just about self-honesty. And you could see if a person was applying this on top of the 12 steps that they don't compete at all. They actually would support each other. So this is just good therapy. Like the motivational interviewing book that I referenced earlier is a book that most therapists are introduced to in graduate school. And it's the same kind of approach. You don't engage in a power struggle. So if you're trying to jam the 12 steps down somebody's throat or prove to them that they're an alcoholic or debate with them, you're not following this. That's just bad therapy. So I think that both can be used and both have their value and both make sense. And I wouldn't want any of our therapists in any diagnostic category not using the principles involved in the 7 challenges. That's just a healthy way to be. There's some others out there. I put some URLs here. The Refuge Recovery is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program. You can go to that website there, and you can find out about meetings in your town, in your area. So the meetings are expanded. For some people where Western religions or ideas about God are threatening, the Refuge Recovery says you don't have to have a belief in a specific deity or a God to do it, but there still can be a spiritual component. Rational recovery and smart recoveries in some ways are reactions against the 12-step. And again, the response need be by anybody, if it works for you, to both be sober and reduce your suffering and have a happy, fulfilling life, then who am I to say which one you should do? Even people's version of 12-step recovery programs is different. Right? My 12-step might be different than your 12-step. And ideally, even by their own principles, their own traditions, I don't try to impose my version of it on you. And vice versa. I say, this is what works for me. You go to an AA meeting or an Al-Anon meeting, and the idea is to share experience, strength, and hope with people. It's a program of attraction, they say. not promotion. So I say, this is what has worked for me. It gets you out of advice. It gets you out of knowing somebody else's truth. And again, as parents, in our codependent ways, we get in the business of thinking we need to fix or control the other person, right? That's what we do. We think we know their truth, and we impose it on them. And we don't. We have a hard enough time finding our own truth. We can share that. I shared this example of David Bowie, the interview of David Bowie, I think it was in the 1970s, I'm not sure, maybe 1980s. After he got sober, and he was asked by the interviewer, you can Google it if you want to, he's asked by the interviewer, so you can't have a drink of alcohol? And he said, for me, I can't. All I know is for me, it's a disaster. I know where that road goes. He said for me, 5 or 6 times in a 30 or 40 second interview, or a response to a question in an interview. And that's him living it. Right? That's how, and even at our meetings, at our parent meetings, that's what I want parents to practice. It's not giving advice or fixing somebody else. It's just saying, I've had an experience kind of like that. Here's what's helped me. I don't know if it'll work for you. I don't know if it works for anybody here, but this is what has worked for me. This is how thinking about it or responding to it has helped me to be happy. So I offer that as an idea. You can take it or leave it, and I'm definitely not going to try to sell you on it. So anyway, those are a few other resources that we can connect to. I think most important for parents is that you make your recovery from codependency your project. I can't say it more clearly than that. Right? Your project is not to fix the addict or alcoholic. Your project is to fix your codependency, your participation in and around that behavior. And again, that's not a passive stance. People that work on their codependency become very active, very honest, very authentic, very assertive in their relationships, very clear in their relationships. So that's your project, not fixing the other person. Attending meetings. We ask you at Evoke to attend at least 6 of Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous. And parents who walk in who say, my son or daughter is not an alcoholic, they got other problems. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter. If you just change alcohol use or drug use with self-destructive behaviors, it's the same thing. How do I respond to that? How do I get anxious? How do I give away my serenity? How do I try to control them? How do I feel guilty around that? It's all the same kind of stuff. So we ask you to go to 6. That's what they suggest that you do, is go to 6 and try them out and try some different ones. The idea of looking at it from a medical perspective. You know, when we think about it as a moral failing, and by the way, our science is catching up with what we know intuitively. And our science tells us that mental health and addiction issues are brain diseases. Right? They may have started or been triggered by events or behaviors or choices. That's true. But we each have different predispositions to certain types of behaviors because of our genetics and our early childhood. And then exposure to certain situations, substances can trigger or activate that. But it is a brain disease. And then the brain of an alcoholic is different than the brain of a non-alcoholic or a drug addict or even specific types of drugs or specific types of mood disorders. And we know that because now we can see more clearly the functioning, the firing of the brain, the shape of the brain than we could years ago. You know, I think the idea of logic, I think people try to logic their children out of it, and this is an illogical, dishonest disease, right? It lies. It doesn't think rationally. Just like severe depression and anxiety don't think rationally. There's an idea in Al-Anon that says, you know, you can't argue with a drunk. And I think we argue with drunks all the time. And I don't mean literal drunks. I mean our children. When we're arguing with our children, we're essentially arguing with a drunk. Somebody who's being irrational. They might not have the specific symptoms of substance use disorder, but they don't have a fully developed frontal lobe. And many of them, in the situations where we might be arguing with them, they're thinking like a child. But we want to talk them into it, because we think that's the cure. Because then we won't have to set a boundary and do some of the hard stuff, right? It really becomes about control. And then we make it about right and wrong, like in my chapter in the book on right and wrong. And I just get to have my boundaries. I get to say to my wife, if she's an alcoholic or a problem drinker, I don't have to argue whether she's an alcoholic. I get to say, I can't have alcohol and abuse in my life. And I'm allowed to say that. And she's allowed to say that to me. right? I'm allowed to say to my child, I'm not okay with this. This is my boundary. This is my limit. And by the way, they're allowed to, in life, say that to us, right? But we want them to like it, to agree with it. When really what we get down to is they can say, I don't like this. This is my boundary, mom, dad. If you're making me do that, let me know, but don't talk me into it. Don't debate with me. Don't make me wrong in this process. That's what they could say if they could find that voice, right? If they could really speak authentically, that's what they would say to us. Act early and often. People always say, is it too early? Maybe it's too late. Maybe, and the answer is, too early is always better than too late. If you think of the potential pros and cons of too early versus too late, the risks of too early is that maybe it's they might be angry at you. They might not think it's relevant. Some parents worry that they get exposed to other people. Those are potential risks, correct? But what's too late? Too late is the disease has become so insidious that it's difficult, if not impossible, to treat. And of course, there's the kinds of problems, the kinds of situations that come up from harming others and harming themselves, and even potentially dying in the process. So too early is, and its pros and cons, when weighed against too late, are no match. It's a journey. You're not going to arrive. Being in recovery, being on, again, I don't think this is very different from most therapeutic issues. This is a journey. And we're always on. The people who quit, the people who have learned everything there is to learn, who have arrived in life, those are some of the hardest people to talk to be around. Because they can't learn anything new because they've learned it all. They already have all the answers. They've already figured it out. And so part of this approach, this journey that we're talking about is, and I know it's a big bubble burst. It's a lifelong journey, and the less we can think about it in terms of destinations or arriving, the healthier we're going to be in the process. When you think about a relapse prevention plan, think about that one for you. What's your relapse prevention? What does a relapse look like to you in your codependent behaviors, in your unhealthy parenting behaviors, in your unhealthy communicating, right? Whatever that is, it's different. It might be yelling, raising your voice, might be arguing or debating, might be shaming or guilting. Could be a whole host of things. And then what are you going to do to make that better? If you make that your focus, if you make that your project, it'll have even from the get-go, a fantastic impact on others in your family, because they'll feel that from you. It's much different to be with somebody who's making their emotional and psychological growth their project versus making mine or somebody else's their project. It feels differently. I feel much safer, much more willing to open up, much less shame. I'm more willing to take my walls down and to take some risks in that kind of a relationship, or a relationship with that kind of person. So work on your relapse prevention plan. If you don't have one, make one, write one. The serenity prayer, I didn't list it here, I probably should have. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This is a prayer that is spoken at the end of most 12-step meetings everywhere around the world. And it has 3 main points, which is, please help me to be at peace with the things I can't control. Please help me to work on the things I can. And please help me to know the difference. Our I feel statement that we share with you, that we teach to the clients, to the participants, it essentially, the last part, which is, what's my hope for myself and what's my hope outside of my control? We do that, practice that, so we can become mindful and understand. I have parents that can't do that. When they get to the part about hope inside of their control, they're stuck. Let's use substance abuse as an example. They get to that and they say, what I hope for you is that you'll stop using. What I hope for me is, I don't know. Because they don't think in those ways. They don't think about what they can control. And that leads to depression and anxiety. When we think about what we can control, we feel empowered and liberated and hopeful and optimistic. So, what can I control? I can control how I talk to you. I can be responsible for my own serenity. Right? Instead of making my children responsible for it. Instead of living that crazy idiom, you're only as happy as your least happy child. We can take some responsibility for our own peace and serenity in life. And of course, we're going to be affected by our children, but getting by day to day is our job. for us. We don't need to put that on our children. That doesn't need to be their burden to carry. So living the serenity prayer is a key kind of foundational concept in this process. And then it's not a power struggle. Right? It's the strangest dialectic for a parent, because I'm going to be more active. I'm going to work on listening. I'm going to work on boundaries. I'm going to work on communication skills. I'm going to work on awareness around my own childhood and how it impacts me, and how that impacts me in the way I show up. I'm going to work on my own shame. Right? I'm going to work on all of that. And I'm not going to work on fixing you. But when I work on all that other stuff, I make different decisions. I set different boundaries. I don't tolerate certain things in my life. And I ask for what I need. And I encourage my young adult children to go to therapy, to go to treatment. I send my adolescent children to treatment because I'm not okay with this anymore. And that's good enough for me. So it's a fundamental shift in an individual. And as we think about what is addiction, if you were drawn to this webinar so that you could figure out if your child was an addict, it's kind of the draw to it, right? That's what we think about. You can be satisfied to know that they might meet some of the criteria. You might look at that 3-stage model that I presented and say, I can kind of see where they're in that stage. But the treatment is the same. The therapy is the same. Your work is the same, no matter where they are on it. I think in many ways that's the blessing, if you will, of having a child who struggles, is that we are asked to look at ourselves and develop our awareness of ourselves in ways that parents of children who don't have these kinds of struggles never have to look at. Some do, but most of them don't. And I know a lot of you would say, well, I'll sign up for that. I'd rather do that than have to go through all this pain. But we can make a shift. We can have gratitude with this disease. We can have that expression, I'm a grateful alcoholic, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic, I'm a grateful recovering codependent. I'm grateful that everything didn't go to plan, so that I could have. I had to talk to a mother today who said, it's changing, and I hear this all the time. She said, it's not just about my daughter or my husband. It's about my mother, my family of origin, my in-laws. It's about every relation, my friends. It's changing everything for her, because that's what it does when it comes inside of us. We don't miss the metaphor when we walk into an AA meeting and somebody's talking about their alcoholic husband. We don't not understand how that relates to us. We can see the principles that are involved in that work and how they apply to my relationship with my depressed or anxious daughter, or my boss who can be hot-headed and controlling, or my mother who can be very guilting and overwhelming, or my best friend who always gives me advice and tells me that he knows how to do things better than me. Right? I can start to see how it plays, because when I walk into those meetings, when I look at my relationship with addiction, I look at my piece of it. And when I look at my piece of it, it can change. So, happy to take any questions if any came in. Why are clients with ADHD more prone to using drugs? Is it because of the chemistry involved in ADHD, or the shame that develops when teens cannot succeed socially and academically compared to others? You're right in both accounts. We know there's a high relationship to learning disabilities, ADHD being one of them. We know there's a high correlation to that and school failures and school struggles and substance abuse. We know that. Also, because of the wiring of the brain, because of the way the brain is functioning, some substances bring the person with ADHD a sense of focus, right? It's like they're self-medicating, literally. So, yes, the shame, the feeling out, the not feeling accepted or successful, all of that's a piece of it. And it may very well have a medicating element to it. Besides the fact that the person with ADHD is impulsive, that they're going to have some limitations in executive function, which is rational, forward thinking, kind of seeing the big picture. They're going to be more impulsive. So it's really a trifecta of issues that cause one with ADHD to be prone to or susceptible to substance use disorder. Good question. This is how I think of step one, and it seems to work for me in my experience. We admitted we were powerless over people, places, or things. I love that you said that. I wish every parent, I wish every person was. I wish it was like in our public school system was exposed to the principles, many of the principles in the 12 steps, and many of the principles of the 12 steps are just good principles for living. But when people don't know that, when people act like they are, when I act like I am, when I act like I'm God, like I have to control everything, and then if I don't control it or help fix everybody or everything, then the world's going to fall apart and it's not going to be okay. That's the kind of thinking that goes into that, right? And I end up getting obsessive and controlling and anxious and all those things. And so again, the people that I meet in AA and in Al-Anon and Codependence Anonymous and all of those meaning Narcotics Anonymous, those people are many times some of the most insightful people. They have a debilitating brain disease of addiction. Sometimes it's life-threatening. It's real. But the work, when they're working their program, their recovery, they're a pretty powerful bunch of people. Could you elaborate on how you would apply these steps and tools with kids with anxiety or depression? I'm not in control of my child's depression. I didn't cause it. I can't cure it. I can't control it. Those are the 3 C's that they talk about now and on. So what I am in control of is how well I listen, the boundaries I set. It focuses me back on myself. I can work on my own shame and how that controls me, my own fear and anxiety. In recovery, we make our serenity our responsibility versus what a lot of parents do, what a lot of us do a lot of times when we're slipping, is we say to the child, change your behavior so I'm happy and not anxious. So I'm not worried, so I'm not upset or sad or hurt. Look what you're doing to me. That's how we parent. That's how we try to get them back in line. So when you change your relationship with the disordered behavior or thinking, you don't say things like that. You say, here's what I'm going to do. I am concerned, but here's what I'm going to do to take care of myself. And here's the boundary that I'm going to have around that. And I have to face these fears and these anxieties when I set that boundary because it wasn't okay for me to set them in my family. Or I believed I had to be right. All those things. And so setting boundaries, making parenting decisions, communicating, understanding where your issues and how they affect you are and where they come from, your issues around shame and guilt, right? All of those things absolutely have application to parents with any kind of children, even children that don't even have mental health issues. And again, I'm pretty passionate about this, but the people that I bump into socially, that I'm around socially, whose children don't have any perhaps diagnosable disorders, they don't have an advantage over you. They're not doing better than you. And they don't have to ask themselves some of the questions that you're asking yourself because they don't have symptoms in their family. But I look at it and I think, oh my gosh, if I was in this family, I would go crazy being talked to that way, having that put on me. So not only are they applicable to parents of children with other diseases and disorders and issues, but they are applicable to even if your children don't have diagnosis. That's why the work is the same for parents. The work is the same for the child, whether you're a substance use disordered person, an addict, or not. And that's why the work, when I do sibling webinars, I'll get to this one in a second, when I do sibling webinars, I do them and I realize it's the same work. It's the same stuff that I talk to parents about when I'm talking in relationship to their child who's in treatment. Our 19-year-old son has been living with us. We told him to have a job and to go to therapy, and he's doing that, but he still smokes pot daily. He's finally talking about changing his life and has not been impulsive about it. He goes to his therapist weekly and is facing his difficulties. We're getting results we want, and our relationship with our son is mending. Some would say we're enabling because he still smokes pot. We don't think so. Are we deluding ourselves? Well, the people who have opinions about what you're doing, they can just go back to working on themselves. It's a good question to ask yourself. The answer to that question would be in the subtleties of the process. It doesn't sound like you're deluding yourself. But you could get to a point where you say, this is enough. We've been doing this, and he's been on the verge of changing his life for some time, and so we're not okay. You get to decide the truth for you. And it is important to ask yourself, to learn about enabling behaviors, to learn about rescuing behaviors, to learn about poor boundaries, and then ask yourself the same thing I would say to you with your boundaries is the same thing I was talking about earlier with the addict. You get to decide at the end of the day. And so we go to therapy to ask ourselves tough questions, to look at things about ourselves, to explore the unexplored, to examine ourselves, to look at ourselves. And if we have an empathic, compassionate, wise therapist working with us, they create a situation where we can be clear with ourselves and honest with ourselves without shame and guilt, with courage and honesty. And then we see in the small behaviors. It's all in the details. It's all in the why you're doing what you're doing. You know, I said to a father when he was thinking about having a young adult son come home instead of going away to a sober living environment. I said, if you come home because you think he deserves it, simply, or your love can cure him, or as the father told me, the last time he went away to school, he got into drugs, and so I don't want to let that happen again. So the father's thinking was, I can control this. So that's not going to work. But if he said, I'm going to give him a chance. If he fails, we learn something. If he succeeds, we learn something. I can't control it, but I feel good about the decision. I feel comfortable with it. I feel like I'm doing it from a place of integrity and love and compassion and wisdom, and so he's going to come home. So you see the definition of the disordered relationship is in the why more than the what. Does letting go of what you cannot control mean giving up hope for your addicted child? It means exactly the opposite. See, people that let go are more honest. I'll use this simple example. Imagine that I was letting go with you. I was practicing letting go. What I mean by that, what they talk about that. Then I'm going to actually tell you the truth. Why do I lie to you? Why do I avoid telling you the truth? Because I'm trying to control how you feel. So people that let go are more honest and active. Take more courageous steps. They recognize what they can and can't control. And they focus on what they can and they let go of what they can't. I'm not going to try to fix my son's addiction, but what I am going to do is fix my relationship to him and his use so that it's as healthy as it can be, and then I'll turn the addiction part over to him. That's what it looks like. It's powerful, not passive, not weak. It's courageous and strong and brave. And difficult for most of us. But most people who are practicing letting go, as they talk about it, are incredibly hopeful. So, all right, folks, I'll go through a few things. We have the intensives and workshops. I talk about those all the time. The intensives, if you want to do some really serious work, you come to our intensives. This is for Finding You is for any adult. Heroic Journeys is for families. And they're filling up in the June and July ones, so come in early. The Entrada Workshop are 2-day experiential workshops that you go to with groups of parents, and learn a lot about communication, skills training, and how to relate to your child, and some of the things that your children work, some of the stuff they do. So here's our upcoming parent support groups in Chicago, Southern California, New York City, and Philadelphia. Just came up with the address today in Philadelphia, so that'll be the next one coming up. Is May 11th, and then in New York is May 15th. If you live in New Jersey, you could have 2 in 1 week if you really wanted to. Please email Stephanie at evoketherapy.com to RSVP and let us know that you're coming. Our Pursuits Adventure Trip, go to our website. This is sober fun trips for family all over the world, all kinds of fun stuff. Therapy light, sober fun, good time to reconnect. We want you to go to these 6 of these meetings, any combination of these while your child is with us. If you haven't gone, please start now. Follow us on social media. The book is there. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page to find out about books on every subject recommended by Evoke therapists. And I'm going to a conference this week, so I will be out of town the rest of this week. And the next webinar will be next Monday on the book, The Four Agreements. A fantastic read, a fantastic book. So we'll be doing that next Monday, the 9th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Have a great week. I hope this was a valuable point of contact. Thanks for your questions and comments, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.